This man on your screen was accused of something horrific, not once, but twice. And both times, he walked free. This is the chilling story of the Investor fishing boat, where 8 people lost their lives in a single day, under circumstances that still don't fully make sense. A crime so brutal it shocked an entire community, and a case so complicated that, even after more than 40 years, it remains unsolved. September 6th, 1982. On the cold waters off the coast of Craig, Alaska, a fishing boat called the Investor was found burning. At first, it looked like an accident. Fires at sea aren't unheard of. But when people rushed in to help, they didn't find survivors. They found a crime scene. All 8 people on board were not from the fire, but from something far more brutal. Someone had murdered them and then set the boat on fire to cover it up. The Coulthursts. Mark Coulthurst was 28 years old. He'd grown up in Bellingham, Washington, which is a port city on the coast, so boats had been part of his life since he was a kid. He'd bought his own boat, the Investor, a 58-foot purse seiner. People who knew Mark described him as someone who genuinely loved the work. His wife, Irene, was also 28. They had what I can only describe, based on the accounts of people who knew them, as a real marriage. Not the kind where 2 people are actually partners in the fullest sense of the word. They had 2 kids. Kimberly was 5 years old. John was 4. That particular summer of 1982, Mark and Irene had decided to bring the kids aboard the Investor for the season. And Kimberly had apparently told her father on more than one occasion that she was going to be a fisherman when she grew up. She already decided at a very young age what she wanted to be. The crew that summer were 4 young men: Dean Moon, 19, Jerome Keown, 20, Chris Heyman, 19, Mike Stewart, who was 17 years old. These were kids, not teenagers and guys barely into their 20s who had taken seasonal work on a fishing boat. September 5th, 1982. The Investor sat quietly in the harbor near Craig, Alaska. Just another fishing vessel at rest after a long day. Sometime during that night, under the cover of darkness, someone came aboard. By morning, every single person on that boat was dead. There were 8 victims in total: Mark and Irene, their 2 young children, and 4 teenage crew members who had come to Alaska for seasonal work. What happened inside that vessel wasn't an accident, and it wasn't sudden chaos. The evidence made it clear this was deliberate, and then, just as deliberately, they tried to erase it. The Investor was set on fire, not as a panic reaction, but as a calculated attempt to destroy everything inside: any evidence, any trace, and any chance of understanding what had happened that night. The flames burned for hours. By the time people in the harbor noticed the smoke the next morning and rushed toward it, hoping to help, the damage was already done. The fire had taken hold, and whatever answers might have been left behind were already slipping away with it. What remained was a crime scene, 8 lives lost, and the beginning of a case that would haunt investigators and families for decades. The Alaska State Troopers who arrived at that harbor on the morning of September 6, 1982, were walking into a scene that had been specifically engineered to defeat them, and they knew it immediately. In the days after the fire, investigators began the slow process of reconstructing September 5th. Who was in the harbor that night? Which boats were where? Who had been seen? Who had been out on the water at the wrong hour? And one name kept coming up: John Peel, a 28 years old fisherman, same age as Mark Coulthurst, someone who had been in that harbor on that night. John Peel was not a stranger. He was not an unknown face that nobody could place. He competed for the same grounds. He had almost certainly crossed paths with Mark Coulthurst dozens of times over the years. In all likelihood, he had waved at Mark from his boat. Investigators had a problem, though. The fire had done its job well. Physical evidence was limited. At the kind of evidence they'd need to walk into a courtroom with fingerprints, trace materials, the forensic backbone of a prosecution. Most of that was gone. What they had was a witness. His name was Lawrence Demert. He was a fisherman. He'd been on the water that night, and he told investigators something that would become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. On the night of the murders, he said he had been close enough to see clearly. He said there was absolutely no question in his mind about what he had seen. For investigators, that was the spine of everything. For the Coulthursts family, who had spent the months since September trying to understand what had happened to their son and daughter-in-law, those 2 grandchildren, and those 4 young men, this felt like the moment the ground became solid again. Like maybe the system was actually going to do something. They were about to discover how fragile that feeling was. 3 years passed before the case went to trial. The first trial of John Peel opened in 1985. Demert took the stand. He said what he had told investigators. He said he saw John Peel on the Investor on that night. The defense went after him hard: his position on the water, the visibility conditions, whether what he claimed to have seen was even physically possible from where he said he was standing. Their job wasn't to prove Demmert was lying. Their job was simply to make the jury doubt him, to create enough uncertainty that at least one or two jurors couldn't get all the way to beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated 10 votes to convict, 2 votes to acquit, a hung jury, a mistrial. Now I want to explain something here that I think is genuinely important to understand, not just for this case, but for how this system works. In the American legal system, a criminal conviction requires a unanimous verdict. All 12 jurors, every single one, with no exceptions. And the reason for that rule is sound. When you're talking about taking away a person's freedom, potentially for the rest of their life, the standard of proof should be essentially unreachable for anything short of certainty. The system is designed deliberately and intentionally to protect the accused. That protection exists because wrongful convictions happen, and the founding logic of the system says it is better to let guilty people go than to imprison innocent ones. But it means that 10 people can look at the evidence, hear the testimony, consider everything, and conclude that, yes, beyond any reasonable doubt, this person did it. And 2 people can say they're not sure, and the result is the same as if no one voted to convict at all. For the Coulthurst family, who had waited 3 years for that courtroom, 10 to 2 felt like the floor giving way under them, knowing that in some number of weeks or months, they'd have to come back and try again. The second trial opened in 1986. Same case, same evidence, same witness at the center of everything, except that Lawrence Demmert was not quite the same witness the second time around. 3 more years had passed. The defense had 3 more years to go through every word he had ever said, every statement he had ever given to investigators, looking for inconsistencies, looking for anything they could use to suggest that his account wasn't reliable. Under cross-examination in that second trial, things began to shift. Details that didn't quite line up the way they had before. The defense pressed each one, and beyond the cross-examination itself, there were accounts that emerged. Accounts that were troubling and that I want to be careful about because the official record doesn't give us a complete picture here, suggesting that the pressures on Demmert's testimony may have extended beyond what was happening in that courtroom. What exactly those pressures were, who may have been involved, whether they changed what he was willing to say on the stand, I genuinely cannot tell you with certainty. The record doesn't fully answer that question. What the record does tell us is that the testimony that had convinced 10 out of 12 jurors in the first trial did not hold together in the same way the second time. The spine of the prosecution broke at exactly the point where it couldn't afford to. I want to be precise about something before I close out because I think precision is the only thing I can actually offer the Coulthursts family from where I'm sitting. John Peel was tried twice. He was acquitted by a jury. In the eyes of the American legal system, he is an innocent man. Sadly, this is where the story ends without any conclusion and a clear picture of this case.